Hello strangers, I'm Mimi. Before we get started with this video series, I want to remind everybody that this is not a substitute for mental health therapy or psychological advice, but rather a place to gain information about a mental health condition that affects nearly 8 million adults per year in the United States alone. If you feel you are in crisis or in need of mental health services, 988 is a national hotline crisis line number that you can reach out to via text or call. It's 24/7 and it's judgment-free, and it can help you get connected with the resources you may need. So for now, sit back, settle in, and let's talk about mental health. Hello strangers, I'm Mimi. I want to remind everybody that I'm here as an ordinary person living in this world, on this earth, at this time, and I happen to be a mental health therapist. Today's episode, we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, as well as complex PTSD. What is it, who it affects, how it impacts you, and what it's like to really live with it. So what is post-traumatic stress disorder? PTSD is the result of experiencing, being exposed, or witnessing a single traumatic event, whereas complex PTSD is that exposure, experiencing, or witnessing a prolonged or repeated traumatic events. So let's talk about symptoms. There's various kinds of symptoms. One, intrusive symptoms. Things like involuntary memories, disturbing dreams, nightmares, flashbacks, some type of psychological, physical distress. We have avoidance symptoms. Things like denial, refusal to have thoughts, feelings, and memories of something. Avoidance of people, places, and things that remind us of that trauma. Additional symptoms include a negative alteration of mood and thought, such as difficulty remembering details or memories or images of an event, a negative belief system, distorted blame, a chronic negative emotional state, feelings of detachment, and an inability to experience positive feelings and experiences. Another set of symptoms, such as arousal and reactivity, such as irritability, anger, reckless and self-destructive behavior to oneself or your environment or others, hypervigilance, having an exaggerated startle response, trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating. So let's talk about how all these symptoms can affect us. Well, let's consider the areas of our life. We have our physical well-being, we have our emotional well-being, our mental and cognitive health, we have our social relationships, we have our spirituality and purpose, we have our careers, we have our jobs, we have our finances, we have our recreation and leisure, we have our intellectual growth, we have our communities, we have personal development, our environment. Yeah, PTSD and complex PTSD can affect all of them, some of them, one of them. So when I talk about what it's like to really live with PTSD or C-PTSD, imagine that. You often hear yourself say, I got so much going on. Well, you got so much going on. We're made up of a lot of different areas of our life. So as you've listened to this video today, please be gentle with yourselves. Show yourself some love, show yourself some grace. It's a lot to unpack, it's a lot to unravel. So take your time. So let's review. The way in which I want to review is I would like to share with you some stories of my life. Now at this point in the video, you're welcome to leave. It's okay. It could be triggering. It could stir up some things. So do use your discernment on if you've had enough so far. So let's talk about traumatic event. When I was 4 years old, I was attacked and mauled by a dog. A single traumatic event. The reason that event occurred had everything to do with the nature of my family at the time, the circumstances of my situation. My parents were separated. My mother was suffering from alcoholism and addiction to prescription drugs, as well as my grandmother. And my parents were separated, and my father thought I should go spend some time with my mom. So I was taken to where my mother was, and she was staying with my grandmother at the time. And on that property was a vicious dog who had been chained up back in the edge of the property of the farm, such that it was. My mom was distracted by her addiction, and I was left alone. Well, I'm 4. I went out wandering. And, well, what happened, happened. Now, that was the circumstances of my life that put me in that situation. That circumstance, that environment, that existence of my mother and my grandmother and my dad, well, that made up the complex PTSD. Those circumstances didn't really change following the single traumatic event. And although I wasn't attacked and mauled by any other dogs, the circumstances didn't change. And I was put in danger unbeknownst to my family. And I don't blame them. I'm not angry at them. I don't blame them, at least not anymore. I understand it all. So that was the makings of where it all began. Intrusive symptoms. Well, I'd have those involuntary memories. I'd had bad dreams. I'd have flashbacks. I had a lot of psychological and physical distress, mostly triggered by barking dogs. Now, I grew up in a time where we walked home from school by ourselves a lot, and it wasn't uncommon that a dog would run up to the fence when somebody was walking by. Each and every time that happened, well, I got re-triggered. And that leads into the avoidance symptom. So I would often not want to talk about that event. I didn't want to talk about why I was there. I didn't want to talk about what happened to me. I also avoided people, places, and things. Well, as a kid, I learned that the neighbor down the street has a dog. So I'd cross the street in order not to have to walk next to the house. Now let's talk about negative alterations to mood and cognition. For me, I had a lot of inability to remember aspects of that event. I remember them out of sequence. I remembered it one way that might not have been accurate. I grew into a lot of negative belief systems. Now this one, again, may be hard to hear for some of you. Now at the time, it was just this thing that happened. I was a girl who went up to a dog, and the dog didn't know any better, and the dog did what the dog did. I later began to wonder, why was I in that situation? You should have been watching me, Mom, right? And I did get very angry, and I did blame her. There was a lot of distorted blame I blamed everybody. I also then created in myself this level of shame. On one hand, the shame was about my physical appearance. Now I have some scars on my head that you probably wouldn't even notice. In fact, this right here, this is part of that. And when I was in high school, I thought it was the biggest thing that everybody could see, and I was very self-conscious of it. Thank goodness for bangs. But after I became more of an adult, I realized nobody even notices. And I was able to get past that one. But the internal, the deeper belief system that I grew out of that was I wasn't worthy enough to be paid attention to. I'm not lovable. Nobody cares about me. I'm, easily discarded. And that was a tough one. And that took a lot of years of therapy to unwind and unravel and heal from. The arousal and reactivity symptoms. Okay, so when we talk about being irritable, being angry, having reckless and self-destructive behavior, having an exaggerated, startled response. Well, some of that's quite normal. I would get very startled when I heard a dog bark. And I grew up in a time where we walked home from school a lot by ourselves. And when I would walk home, which was maybe a couple miles, I would often walk by a neighbor's house and they would have a dog and it would run up to the fence and it would jump its paws on the top of the fence and bark and bark and bark. Well, that was horrible for me as a kid. I began to learn to avoid that across the street when I was walking home, and I figured out a way to navigate it. The hypervigilance, it made me a very anxious person. I was always waiting for something to happen. I always second-guessed things that I did. I felt that there was a big danger out in the world that could happen to me at any time. Reckless and self-destructive behavior, irritability and anger, those were really rooted out of the complex PTSD. Now, if you remember me saying before that after the incident happened and we all got through it, my environment really didn't change. And I kept finding myself in similar situations where danger was happening to me. Not always physical, but certainly mental and emotional. And I started to get older, and I started to have language to describe it. And I started to have more sophisticated feelings. And I was irritable, and I was angry at what was happening. But again, in my environment, you didn't express anger and irritability. That was reserved for my father. Well, I needed to put it somewhere. So I became a hothead. I became, not always nice. I had a quick forked tongue. I was in a bad mood all the time. Right? I didn't like how that felt either. I wanted that feeling to go away. So I figured out how to self-medicate. I figured out how to indulge in things that let me forget for a while. I also grew very daydreamy. I let my mind detach, and I went off to different places and worlds in my head. I dreamed of the future. I played out scenarios in my head of yelling and fighting with people as a means to try to put that somewhere. I also grew into a person who chronically had problems sleeping, chronically had problems concentrating. My comprehension wasn't very good. I wasn't the best student. And to this day, those are still areas that I struggle with. And I have since been labeled with new diagnosis, and I received treatment for them. So I hope that what you got from this is some relatability to how something can happen and what it might look like. Now, again, my experience is not your experience, but if you spend some time thinking about something that might have occurred to you and why it occurred, you might be able to see some parallels for your life. I'm really glad that you joined me here today. And this video series is going to continue to talk about the areas of PTSD and complex PTSD and how it continues to manifest and what we can do to heal from it. I am really glad that you're here today. So thank you for being with me. Hello, strangers. I'm Amy.